Have you ever wondered why you keep returning to what destroys you? Why that addiction consuming you seems impossible to abandon, even knowing it's slowly killing you? What if I told you your addiction isn't your enemy, but a desperate message from your true self, a divine voice trying to wake you up? Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of all time, discovered something shocking. Addiction is merely a symptom. The real disease? Disconnection from your soul. What you seek in alcohol, drugs, sex, compulsive shopping isn't pleasure. It's reconnection with something sacred you've lost, something modern society has ripped away from you. Prepare yourself for a truth that will change your life forever. Your addiction might be the most powerful call to your spiritual transformation. In the darkest corners of your mind lives something powerful yet hidden from your everyday awareness. Carl Jung called this the shadow, all those parts of yourself you've been taught to reject, suppress, and deny. The parts society told you were too much, too little, too strange, too dark. Your anger, your sadness, your wildness, your vulnerability, your power. What happens to these rejected parts? Do they simply disappear because you push them away? Jung discovered something remarkable. What we reject doesn't vanish. It goes underground. It hides in the shadows of our unconscious mind. And from there, it speaks to us in the language of compulsion, obsession, and addiction. Think about your particular struggle. What is it that pulls you in so strongly you can't resist? Is it the bottle that promises relief from anxiety, the substance that momentarily makes you feel alive, the behavior that briefly fills the emptiness? Whatever form it takes, your addiction isn't random. It's speaking a profound truth about what your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The man who drinks to numb his feelings isn't just an alcoholic. He's someone whose emotional sensitivity was deemed unacceptable, perhaps as a boy told, "Men don't cry." The woman endlessly shopping for things she doesn't need isn't just materialistic. She's filling a void of self-worth in a world that taught her value comes from external validation. The person who can't stop working isn't just ambitious. They're desperately trying to prove their worth in a culture that equates productivity with human value. Your addiction is the shadow knocking loudly on the door of your awareness, saying, "You've forgotten something essential. You've abandoned a crucial part of yourself, and I won't let you rest until you reclaim it." This is why willpower alone so often fails. You're not fighting a substance or behavior. You're fighting a disowned part of your soul that's desperately trying to be heard. The more you resist without listening to its message, the louder it screams through intensified cravings. Jung understood this wasn't just a psychological process, but a spiritual one. In his work with alcoholics, he noted that true recovery often involved a spiritual experience, a profound reconnection with the whole self, including those shadow aspects we've tried to leave behind. What might your particular struggle be trying to tell you? The path forward isn't about fighting harder against your addiction. It's about turning toward it with curiosity rather than judgment. What neglected part of yourself might be speaking through this behavior? What emotions are you avoiding? What needs remain unfulfilled? When you begin this dialogue with your shadow, something remarkable happens. The compulsion begins to lose its grip. Not because you've defeated it through force of will, but because you've finally understood its message. You've started the process of reclaiming those lost parts of yourself. This is why Jung saw addiction not as moral failure, but as a misguided attempt at self-healing. Your psyche is always seeking wholeness. When conscious choices block this natural movement toward integration, the unconscious mind will find another way, often through the back door of addiction. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply the repository of all you've been unable to face or express. And it will continue making itself known through destructive patterns until you acknowledge its presence and the wisdom it carries. Your recovery journey begins with this radical shift in perspective. Your addiction isn't the enemy, it's the messenger. And until you receive its message, until you reclaim those rejected aspects of your being, it will continue to speak in the only language it knows, the language of compulsion. The path to freedom lies not in pushing away your shadow, but in embracing it, not in fighting your addiction, but in understanding what it's been trying to tell you all along. This is the beginning of true healing, not merely abstinence from a behavior, but the reclamation of your whole self. Throughout human history, cultures worldwide created sacred rituals to connect with something greater than themselves. Ancient ceremonies, rites of passage, communal celebrations, these weren't mere superstitions. They fulfilled something essential in the human spirit. They gave structure to our deepest longings for meaning, belonging, and transcendence. But look around today. Where are our meaningful rituals? In our rush toward progress and rationality, we've stripped away most ceremonial aspects of life. We've declared ourselves too advanced for such things. We prioritize efficiency over meaning, information over wisdom, productivity over presence. Jung recognized this as a profound spiritual crisis of the modern age. He wrote, "Modern man doesn't understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. In other words, when we abandon conscious ritual, unconscious compulsions rise to take their place." Think about the nature of addiction itself. Notice how ritual-like it becomes. The alcoholic doesn't just drink. They develop precise patterns around when, where, and how. The substance becomes sacred in a twisted way. The behavior follows predictable steps. There's preparation, anticipation, the moment of consumption, and the aftermath. A dark parody of religious ceremony. This isn't coincidence. Your psyche craves ritual connection with something beyond ordinary reality. When healthy channels for this aren't available, the need doesn't disappear. It goes underground, emerging as compulsive behavior that provides a counterfeit version of what true ritual offers. Real ritual connects us to community, meaning, and transcendence. Addiction offers isolation disguised as connection, momentary escape mistaken for transcendence, and repeated behavior that mimics meaning but leaves us emptier each time. Consider how many addictions involve altered states of consciousness. Humans have always sought to transcend ordinary awareness, whether through meditation, prayer, dance, or ceremonial substances used in sacred contexts. These practices, when embedded in meaningful ritual, serve to connect people with deeper aspects of themselves and their communities. But in a society that acknowledges few legitimate ways to access these altered states, people turn to whatever works. The businessman drinking himself numb each evening isn't just avoiding stress. He's unconsciously attempting a botched version of what indigenous cultures might have achieved through guided vision quests or community ceremonies. Jung understood that rituals serve a crucial psychological function. They provide a container for powerful energies of the unconscious mind. Without this container, these energies don't simply vanish. They emerge chaotically, often destructively. This is why recovery programs that incorporate ritual elements, like the ceremonial aspects of 12-step meetings, often succeed where purely clinical approaches fail. They're not just treating a disease, but addressing a spiritual hunger that goes unrecognized in conventional treatment. The addict's journey toward healing often involves reclaiming authentic ritual, finding ways to honor transitions in life, creating ceremonies that acknowledge grief, celebrate joy, mark important changes, establishing daily practices that connect with deeper meaning. These aren't optional add-ons to recovery. They're essential replacements for the profane rituals of addiction. Your compulsive behaviors may be pointing toward a legitimate spiritual need, one our modern world often fails to acknowledge: the craving for transcendence, for meaning beyond the mundane, for connection with something greater than yourself. These aren't weaknesses or flaws. They're fundamental human needs that every culture before ours recognized and honored. Jung believed modern people suffer not from too much religion, but from too little genuine spiritual connection. We've dismissed the old ways without creating adequate new ones. We've explained away myth and ritual without understanding their psychological necessity. Your addiction may be highlighting this very void, the absence of meaningful ritual in your life. The path forward might involve not just stopping a destructive behavior, but creating conscious ceremonies to replace unconscious compulsions, morning practices that center you, evening reflections that help process the day, marking seasonal changes, honoring life transitions, creating personal rituals that speak to your deepest needs. As you recognize the spiritual hunger behind your compulsive patterns, you can begin deliberately filling that void with practices that truly nourish rather than deplete you. This isn't about returning to religions that no longer speak to you, but about acknowledging the ritual needs your addiction has been highlighting all along. Your shadow has been leading you toward what your conscious mind forgot: the essential human need for meaningful ceremony. By reclaiming this wisdom, you transform your relationship with the very behaviors that have caused such suffering. They become not enemies to be defeated, but misguided messengers pointing toward your authentic spiritual path. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the SIM Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Beneath the surface of every addiction lies a profound message waiting to be heard. Jung discovered that our psyche doesn't speak primarily through logical thoughts, but through symbols, emotions, and compelling urges. When conventional channels of communication fail, the soul finds other ways to make itself known. Think about what happens in the moments before you reach for your particular escape. There's usually an uncomfortable feeling you're trying to avoid. Anxiety tightening your chest. Loneliness expanding in the pit of your stomach. Boredom making the hours stretch endlessly. Perhaps a sense of meaninglessness that makes you question everything. These feelings aren't random glitches in your system to be eliminated. They're messengers carrying vital information about what your life is lacking. The anxiety might be telling you you've strayed from your authentic path. The loneliness might be highlighting your disconnection not just from others, but from yourself. The meaninglessness might be pointing toward unfulfilled potential or abandoned dreams. Your addiction is like a painkiller masking these symptoms. It doesn't solve the underlying condition, it temporarily silences the messengers. But those messengers aren't your enemies. They're trying to guide you toward wholeness. Jung observed that many of his patients' psychological symptoms emerged when they ignored their soul's direction. He wrote, "The gods have become diseases." And that what he meant was profound. The energies and archetypes we once honored as divine forces don't simply disappear when we stop acknowledging them. They emerge instead as psychological symptoms, including addictions. Consider how often addiction follows major life transitions or emerges during periods when you've compromised your deepest values. The executive who starts drinking heavily after taking a soul-crushing job for the money. The artist who becomes addicted to painkillers after abandoning creative pursuits for practical reasons. The person who develops compulsive behaviors following spiritual disillusionment. These aren't coincidences. Your addiction might be the voice of your authentic self screaming to be heard when all other channels have been blocked. It's the soul's emergency broadcast system. This perspective transforms how you view your struggle. Instead of seeing your compulsion as evidence of weakness or moral failure, you can recognize it as a misguided attempt at self-correction. Your psyche, in its wisdom, is trying to restore balance, albeit through destructive means. What might your particular addiction be trying to tell you? Look at the specific form it takes for clues. Addictions to stimulants often mask depression or burnout, the soul crying out for genuine energy and engagement. Dependence on depressants frequently covers overwhelming emotions needing authentic expression and processing. Behavioral addictions like gambling or shopping might point toward unfulfilled needs for excitement, risk, or abundance in a life that's become too restricted. The key insight here is that your compulsion isn't random. It's specifically matched to what's missing. It offers a counterfeit version of exactly what your soul is truly seeking. This is why simple abstinence often fails as a recovery strategy. Removing the substance or behavior without addressing the underlying message creates a vacuum. The cry continues, sometimes growing louder in the absence of even the temporary relief addiction provided. Jung's approach suggests a different path, learning to hear the message directly rather than drowning it out. This might involve practices like active imagination, dream work, journaling, or therapy approaches that help you dialogue with the deeper parts of yourself speaking through your addiction. As you begin this conversation, remarkable shifts occur. The compulsion loosens its grip, not because you've fought it into submission, but because you've finally received its message. You've begun addressing the real need rather than its counterfeit fulfillment. This process involves courage, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths your addiction has been both revealing and concealing. Perhaps you've been living according to others' expectations rather than your own knowing. Maybe you've been denying legitimate needs for rest, play, creativity, or connection. Perhaps you've been avoiding grief, anger, or other emotions deemed unacceptable. Whatever messages await, receiving them with compassion rather than judgment allows healing to begin. Your compulsion, once understood as communication rather than enemy, can guide you toward the very transformation it's been desperately trying to facilitate all along. This perspective doesn't minimize addiction's destructiveness or suggest you should continue harmful behaviors. Rather, it invites you to view your struggle through a wider lens, one that includes not just the behavior itself, but the wisdom trying to emerge through it. Your addiction, in this light, becomes not just a problem to solve, but a doorway to deeper self-understanding. The very thing that seems to be destroying you might be pointing the way toward your salvation, if only you learn to hear its cry, not as noise to silence, but as communication to understand. The way we think about addiction in modern society resembles preparing for battle. We fight cravings, resist temptation, struggle against urges, and often lose this war despite our best efforts. This combat metaphor shapes our entire approach to recovery, and according to Jung's insights, it might be precisely what keeps us trapped. When you declare something within yourself the enemy, you create an internal division that actually strengthens what you're trying to overcome. Jung observed this psychological principle repeatedly. What we resist persists. What we fight gains power from our opposition. The more energy we invest in battling our addictions, the more energy we inadvertently feed them. This isn't to suggest surrendering to destructive behaviors. Rather, it points toward a radical shift in relationship with the very forces that have caused such suffering. What if your addiction isn't your enemy, but a misunderstood ally? What if the energy driving your compulsion could be redirected rather than eliminated? Jung called this process transmutation, transforming rather than destroying psychological energies. He believed true healing doesn't come from vanquishing unwanted parts of ourselves, but from recognizing their distorted wisdom and finding healthier expressions for their underlying energy. Consider the determination with which someone pursues their drug of choice, the creativity they employ to obtain it, the persistence despite obstacles. These qualities themselves aren't negative. They're powerful forces being channeled destructively. In recovery, these same energies can be redirected toward healing, growth, and service. The alcoholic's desire to escape ordinary consciousness might become meditation practice. The workaholic's drive could fuel passion projects aligned with deeper values. The shopping addict's craving for newness might transform into creative expression. The energy doesn't disappear, it finds new, life-giving channels. This perspective removes shame from the equation. Your addiction isn't evidence of fundamental brokenness, but of misdirected power. You haven't been weak. You've been strong in ways that ultimately harm rather than serve you. Jung's approach to integration, rather than elimination, creates space for compassion toward yourself. Instead of battling against your cravings with white-knuckled willpower, you can begin curious dialogue with them. What are you seeking through this behavior? What legitimate need lies beneath? How might we fulfill this need in ways that bring life rather than destruction? This shift transforms recovery from constant struggle to alchemical process, turning lead into gold, not by destroying the lead, but by recognizing its potential for transformation. The very qualities that drive addiction, intensity, desire for transcendence, need for comfort, seeking connection, can become foundations for a rich, meaningful life when properly channeled. Practically speaking, this means developing new relationship with urges when they arise. Rather than viewing them as enemies to be vanquished, you might greet them as messengers carrying important information. There you are again. What are you trying to tell me today? What need is going unfulfilled? What alternative might satisfy the legitimate hunger beneath this craving? This isn't passive acceptance of destructive patterns, but active engagement with their deeper meaning. It's recognition that the energy of addiction can be neither suppressed nor eliminated, only transformed. Many who've achieved lasting recovery report this paradoxical truth. Healing began not when they fought harder against their addiction, but when they stopped fighting altogether and started listening. Not when they mustered more willpower, but when they developed more willingness to understand. Jung observed that psychological healing often follows this pattern of apparent surrender that leads to unexpected transformation. He wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. This is the peace that comes not from victory in battle, but from reconciliation with formerly opposing forces." Your addiction, seen through this lens, becomes not a permanent enemy, but a temporary teacher. Its lessons, once integrated, no longer need to manifest as compulsion. The energy that once drove destructive behavior becomes fuel for your authentic path. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience, practice, and often support from others who understand this alchemical process. But each step toward understanding rather than combat brings you closer to lasting freedom. Not freedom from the energy of your addiction, but freedom to channel that energy toward what truly nourishes your soul. As you shift from seeing your compulsion as adversary to recognizing it as misguided ally, you reclaim the power that's been locked in the cycle of craving and resistance. You discover that what you've been fighting against contains precisely the life force needed for your healing, once it's understood and redirected toward its proper aim. What if your addiction isn't just psychological, but spiritual in nature? This was one of Jung's most profound insights, that behind many modern psychological struggles lies a spiritual crisis, a hunger that no amount of therapy, medication, or behavioral modification can fully address. Jung wrote, "Among all my patients in the second half of life, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life." By religious, he didn't mean traditional church attendance or dogmatic belief. He meant connection with something greater than the individual ego, something transcendent that gives life ultimate meaning. In our secular age, we've largely abandoned the language of the sacred. We speak of mental health issues, biochemical imbalances, and maladaptive coping mechanisms. These frameworks have value, but they often miss the deeper dimension of human suffering, the spiritual vacuum at the heart of many addictions. Look closely at what addiction provides in the moment. Beyond physical relief or pleasure, it often offers a brief sense of wholeness, a temporary escape from the divided self, a fleeting experience of transcendence. These are fundamentally spiritual experiences, albeit in distorted form, the alcoholic's moment of peace when the drink first hits, the gambler's timeless zone of complete absorption, the momentary relief from the burden of self-consciousness that many addictions provide. These aren't just chemical reactions or psychological states. They're counterfeit versions of genuine spiritual experiences. This explains why so many recovery stories include spiritual awakening. The founders of Alcoholics Anonymous understood this connection, making spiritual experience central to their approach. Jung himself corresponded with AA's co-founder Bill Wilson, affirming that for many addicts, spirits of the bottle can only be overcome by connection with spirit in a more authentic form. Your addiction may be pointing toward your deepest spiritual hunger, a hunger our materialistic culture rarely acknowledges, much less satisfies. The endless craving for more that drives addictive cycles reflects a legitimate yearning for infinity that no finite substance or experience can ever fulfill. This perspective doesn't minimize addiction's destructiveness, but places it in a larger context. The energy driving your compulsion isn't wrong, it's simply misdirected. Your soul is seeking connection with something transcendent, but in the absence of genuine spiritual channels, this hunger attaches to whatever provides even temporary relief from ordinary fragmented consciousness. Jung observed that modern people often dream of religious symbols they consciously reject, crosses, mandalas, divine figures, suggesting the psyche naturally gravitates toward the sacred, regardless of conscious belief. Your addiction might be serving a similar function, pointing toward transcendent needs your rational mind has dismissed. What might this mean for recovery? It suggests that alongside psychological and physical approaches, spiritual practices may be essential. Not necessarily traditional religion, though that works for many, but authentic connection with something beyond the limited self, whether through nature, art, service to others, meditation, or any practice that transcends ego boundaries. Many find that as they develop genuine spiritual connection, the false promise of addiction loses its grip. The counterfeit becomes less appealing when the authentic becomes available. This isn't about exchanging one dependency for another, but about finding natural fulfillment for the very hunger that addiction exploited. Consider how recovery communities often succeed where individual willpower fails. The power of connection with others facing similar struggles provides not just practical support, but a kind of communal spirituality, a recognition that we are not isolated selves, but interconnected beings. This alone can satisfy some of the spiritual hunger-driving addictive patterns. Your particular addiction may offer specific clues about your spiritual path. Someone drawn to stimulants might need more authentic vitality and engagement. A person struggling with depressants might be seeking legitimate stillness and surrender. Behavioral addictions might point toward needs for meaningful ritual or expression. Jung's approach invites looking beyond the behavior itself to the legitimate spiritual need it mimics. Rather than merely stopping the addiction, you can begin consciously cultivating experiences that fulfill the same need in life-giving rather than life-destroying ways. This doesn't mean spiritual awakening makes recovery effortless. The path often includes struggle, setbacks, and ongoing practice. But understanding the spiritual dimension can transform how you view this journey, not just as freedom from addiction, but as freedom for authentic connection with what truly matters. Many who achieve lasting recovery report that their addiction, despite its destruction, ultimately led them towards spiritual depth they might otherwise never have found. The very intensity of suffering broke through defenses that kept them from deeper dimensions of existence. What began as crisis became, paradoxically, the doorway to more authentic living. Your addiction, in this light, might be understood as not just a problem, but a distress signal from your soul. A desperate attempt to wake you up to dimensions of reality your ordinary consciousness has forgotten or denied. The divine calling through the very thing that seems to be destroying you. Throughout history, alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold. Jung recognized this ancient practice as more than primitive chemistry. It was a profound symbolic system describing psychological and spiritual transformation. The alchemist's work with metals mirrored the soul's journey of turning suffering into meaning, darkness into light, fragmentation into wholeness. Your struggle with addiction can be understood through this alchemical lens. The very experiences that seem most painful and destructive contain the raw material for your deepest transformation. Not despite your suffering, but through it, something precious emerges. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming your whole, authentic self. Unlike many modern psychologists who focus mainly on symptom reduction, Jung saw psychological challenges as potential catalysts for profound growth. The addiction that seems like your greatest curse might become your most powerful teacher. This alchemical perspective reveals why so many who recover from addiction report being ultimately grateful for their struggle. Not because addiction itself is positive, but because the journey through it revealed strengths, insights, and capacities they might never otherwise have discovered. The depth of their suffering created capacity for equally profound joy, compassion, and wisdom. The alchemical process follows certain stages that parallel the recovery journey. First comes the nigredo, the blackening or dark night of the soul. This is the point of greatest suffering, when the addiction has revealed its destructive power. But the path forward remains unclear. Everything seems lost. This stage corresponds to what recovery communities often call hitting bottom. Though painful, this darkness serves an essential purpose. It dissolves old identities and defense mechanisms that no longer serve you. Jung understood that genuine transformation rarely occurs when life is comfortable. The breakdown of one way of being creates space for something new to emerge. The next alchemical stage, albedo or whitening, parallels early recovery, moments of clarity, insight, and hope emerging from the darkness. The pain hasn't disappeared, but meaning begins to form around it. You start recognizing patterns, understanding triggers, seeing connections between your addiction and your life story. This leads to rubedo, the reddening, integration of these insights into lived experience. Knowledge becomes wisdom through practice. You begin not just understanding your patterns, but actively transforming them, creating new neural pathways, new relationships, new ways of responding to life's challenges. The gold that emerges isn't perfection or permanent absence of struggle. It's something more valuable: capacity to find meaning even in difficulty, ability to use former wounds as sources of connection and compassion, transforming personal suffering into service to others facing similar challenges. This alchemical process doesn't follow a linear path. It cycles through darkness and light, struggle and breakthrough repeatedly. What changes isn't the presence of challenges, but your relationship with them. The very urges that once controlled you become opportunities for deeper self-awareness. The pain that once seemed meaningless becomes part of a larger story of transformation. Jung believed this journey toward wholeness is our natural direction, that the psyche continuously moves toward integration unless blocked. Your addiction, paradoxically, may have been both evidence of blockage and the psyche's attempt to overcome it. The very intensity of addictive suffering often breaks through denial and defense mechanisms that prevented authentic growth. Many in recovery discover unexpected gifts emerging from their struggle: enhanced sensitivity to others' pain, deeper capacity for presence, freedom from social masks and pretenses. Genuine humility, balanced with self-worth, based on something more substantial than external achievement or appearance. These gifts don't make addiction worthwhile in itself. The suffering remains real, the losses often permanent. But the alchemical perspective suggests that nothing, not even your darkest moments, need be wasted. Everything can be transformed into the gold of greater consciousness, compassion, and authenticity. This transformative journey rarely happens in isolation. Jung recognized the importance of community in the individuation process. Just as alchemists formed societies to share wisdom about their craft, those recovering from addiction find crucial support in communities of fellow travelers. Your personal transformation intertwines with and contributes to collective healing. The ultimate goal of this alchemical process may be finding meaning not just despite suffering, but through it. Viktor Frankl, influenced by Jung, observed that humans can endure almost any how if they have a meaningful why. Recovery becomes sustainable when it's not just about stopping destructive behavior, but about moving toward purpose that gives life significance. Your addiction story, once transformed through this inner alchemy, becomes not just a tale of personal struggle, but part of the larger human journey toward wholeness. The very experiences that once seemed to separate you from others become the basis for deeper connection. Your wounds, transformed into wisdom, become gifts you offer to a wounded world. This is perhaps the most profound message hidden within addiction, that even our darkest experiences contain seeds of transformation, that nothing in the human journey is merely destructive without also being potentially creative. That suffering, when consciously engaged rather than merely endured or escaped, can lead to depths of meaning and connection otherwise inaccessible. As Jung himself wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Your addiction may have been the painful path that ultimately led you toward greater wholeness, not because suffering itself is necessary, but because it broke through the illusions and defenses that kept you from your authentic self and your deepest connection with life. Your addiction isn't your shame. It's your soul's desperate attempt to wake you up. That emptiness you feel, that pain you try to numb, that endless cycle of relief and regret, it's not evidence of your weakness, but of your spirit's unrelenting call toward wholeness. The very thing destroying you contains the seeds of your transformation. Your deepest wound may become your greatest gift. Your darkest struggle may lead to your most profound awakening. What if you stopped fighting your addiction and started listening to its message? What if the path through your suffering isn't endless battle, but radical acceptance? What if your addiction never was your enemy, but the divine voice calling you home to yourself?